Oh, hello. Welcome to the Project Blue Book Fancast, a podcast dedicated to the TV series Project Blue Book on the History Channel. This podcast is going to be focused on the show and the real cases they were inspired by. My name is Nathan Crow. I'm a huge X-Files fan. I'm into H.P. Lovecraft, noir, and I've had this kind of running curiosity with the UFO phenomena ever since I read Intruders by Bud Hopkins when I was a kid. I used to be in the Air Force, worked for the 509th Intelligence Squadron, among others. So when I saw the first trailer and everyone that was attached to it and what it was about, I could tell it was squarely in my wheelhouse. It gave me a very X-Files feel. And I guess the tagline is X-Files meets Mad Men. And I do like period piece type of stuff, so I mean, it definitely felt like it was going to work. The show setup will kind of be a work in progress while I kind of figure out what works and what doesn't. Mainly because I want to focus on the show and use the actual Project Blue Book cases and historical notes on what the real influences were for the show, and potentially any travel that's related to it, aside from what you would normally get in a podcast where they kind of go over what happened in the show and their opinions about it. Since this is the introductory show, rather than just talking about myself, I'd like to kind of talk about the setting. So that way when we go into the first episode, I don't have to spend any time on it. The show opens in 1952 when the Air Force pulls Dr. Joseph Allen Hynek in to provide legitimacy, basically, to their investigations into the UFO reports to try to calm public panic that was building at the time. Now, that is based on the real atmosphere of the 50s. World War II had just ended in 1945, and pilots were coming home talking about Foo Fighters. Atomic fear was growing at the start of the Cold War with Russia. The public conscious was afraid of UFOs, partially stemming from the War of the Worlds in 1938, kind of tricking the entire East Coast into thinking that there was a real UFO invasion or Martian invasion, and partially stemming from the death of a pilot named Thomas Mantle in January of 1948. Captain Thomas Mantle was a pilot in the Kentucky Air National Guard that died when his P-51 crashed after being sent after an unidentified flying object into high altitude, where he blacked out, causing the crash. Project Sign, the predecessor to Project Blue Book, as well as Project Blue Book, explained it as chasing the planet Venus, and then later a skyhook balloon. Now, Dr. Hynek was part of Project Sign, and part of the Mantle investigation in a way. He was the one who dismissed the Venus explanation when people said that the pilot was chasing the bright dot in the sky was Venus. He pointed out it would not have been bright enough in the sky that night, and with the night haze, not likely. He was the one that suggested the possibility of a skyhook balloon. Captain Edward Ruppelt, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, was assigned to Project Blue Book in 1952 and was interested in Dr. Hynek's explanation and his background as an astronomer. He kind of began to research that skyhook balloon option. Ultimately, Captain Ruppelt summarized with, somewhere in the archives of the Air Force or the Navy, there are records that will show whether or not a balloon was launched from Clinton County Air Force Base, Ohio, on January 7th, 1948. I could never find these records. People who were working with the early Skyhook project remember operating out of Clinton County Air Force Base in 1947, but refuse to be pinned down to a January 7th flight. Maybe, they said, the Mantle incident is the same old UFO jigsaw puzzle. So here, I think we have the basic premise of the show. We have a U.S. Air Force captain and a university astronomy professor looking into how to use legitimate science to explain and calm the general public. Now, they did kind of invert that a little bit because the captain, who in the show, Captain Ruppelt, is Captain Michael Quinn for the show. He is on it first, and then they bring in Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Well, in reality, J. Allen Hynek was attached to it back when it was Project Sign, prior to Project Blue Book. So they inverted it a little bit for the show. So Ruppelt becomes Captain Quinn for the show, and his attitude is modified a bit to be more career oriented, like a military guy going for promotions. So his direction is to close the cases. So that's what he wants to do so he can get a job at the Pentagon. He doesn't really believe in UFOs, nor does he really care if they are real. If they are real, that doesn't affect the fact that he wants to do a job and get the promotion. That's what he cares about. Dr. J. Allen Hynek is a professor at Ohio State University, both in real life and in the show. And in both real life and the show, he was initially a skeptic trying to use science to explain things away, but ultimately, because of the things he saw and the things he investigated or was a part of investigating, he went from being a skeptic to a believer, which I think is going to be a pretty interesting character arc with this show. But it makes sense because that's the character we're ultimately going to become attached to in the show for the most part. And they do a good job by painting his home life, which we don't see Captain Quinn's home life right away. So you do see Professor Hynek's home life, which helps you kind of get drawn into his family dynamic and start caring about both him and his family. So let's talk about some of the show's details. The principal concept and story were created by David O'Leary. He doesn't have too much in the way of previous credits on IMDb, other than a student credit for acting in The Time Machine from 2002. His personal website, though, davidoleary.com, that's david-o'leary.com, lists a writing credit for Radiant Sky, aka Satellite, for the Coalition Group. And it showed something on the Hollywood hit list of top voted scripts for a story called Missing Time. The script is about a man who starts to experience lapses in his memory, some extreme paranoia. Eventually, he discovers the truth about the alien phenomenon, and more disturbingly, that not only are they after him, but his son. This is fundamentally the type of stuff I've read in Bud Hopkins' work, which tells me that Mr. O'Leary isn't some passerby to the topic just trying to make money, but a person who's actually maintained some sort of long-term interest. The showrunner is Sean Jablonski. He's kind of known for Nip Tuck, work on Carlito's Way, Law and Order, Suits, Satisfaction, Oz. He's got a strong history of writing credits and a few directorial credits. So while O'Leary seems to be the concept man for the show, Jablonski appears to be the steady hand for delivering a story that will keep folks in the seats. It makes sense to have a seasoned pro like that in there. There's a few different directors, so I'll probably just focus on them in their particular episodes. The big name takeaway in the executive producer chair is Robert Zemeckis. To try to enlist his career would be ridiculous. So I'll just gonna list some random stuff that he's known for, like in the director's chair, Back to the Future, Forrest Gump, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Castaway, The Polar Express. As a writer, he wrote most of those, and interestingly, he also wrote back in the day an episode of Kolchak the Night Stalker called The Chopper, which is a show that influenced Chris Carter when he was making The X-Files, which in turn inspired the Project Blue Book TV show. A little bit of a full circle there. That's kind of cool. And as a producer, the list just gets out of control. Christmas Carol, Beowulf, Matchstick Men, 13 Ghosts, Gothica, The House of Wax, What Lies Beneath, The Frighteners, Death Becomes Her, and on and on and on and on. So clearly, competent hands involved. The four main actors that did the Comic-Con appearances were Aidan Gillen. Is it Gillen or Guillen? I'm not 100% sure. I think it's Gillen. As Professor J. Allen Hynek. I think most people know him from Game of Thrones. I recognize him from a brief appearance in Dark Knight Rises, and if you're a gamer, which I am, Quantum Break, which is a badass game. I love Remedy games, though. So, specifically Alan Wake. It's probably one of my favorite games of all time. Captain Quinn is played by Michael Malarkey, kind of from the Vampire Diaries and the Oath fame. The completely freaking stunning Laura Mennel, who, I think Mennel is how you pronounce her last name, but she, oh my gosh, she's beautiful. I know her from the show Haven, but she's been in lots of other stuff. The Man in the High Castle, Real Detective, Van Helsing, Legends of Tomorrow, Smallville, Supernatural, Watchmen. You get the point. She's not an unknown quantity, basically. And then there's Neil McDonough, who's been in everything, including The X-Files, another little nice callback there. Minority Report, Captain America, Arrow, Legends of Tomorrow, Ravenous, which is actually where I first saw him, was in Ravenous. Honestly, he's been in so much, it's almost impossible for you not to recognize him. So, I mean, between the writers, directors, producers, actors, all attached to this show, I knew it wasn't going to be some shitty back-channel generic alien conspiracy spoof. They were clearly aiming to make something both high concept and high quality. And you can see that in the visual quality. Like, visually speaking, I'm digging the atmosphere. When people talk about world building, I feel like a lot of shows and TV shows or movies treat audiences like children, basically. They have to verbally walk them through everything. They have to verbally acknowledge stuff, and they won't introduce elements into the story that won't come into play later. Everything has this sort of poetic synchronicity about it. I like when a story introduces elements that never really come back into play because they're just something that exists in the world. To me, that's real world building. In Project Blue Book, they're able to do this sort of stuff because they set the stage with real historical elements. So they can have a little one-off comment about something that's referencing the time period, some pop culture thing from the 50s, and then they'd never have to come back to it. The atmosphere oozes this real sort of red paranoia of the time. The atomic fear and all the things that people were doing to try to make themselves feel safe. It's something so rooted in our culture and taught in our schools and depicted in other period piece movies and TV shows. It's just the acknowledgement of it is able to put me mentally in the right place. Kind of like how Stranger Things tapped into that 80s zeitgeist to its own advantage. The same thing is happening here with Project Blue Book. The visual aesthetic is this mix of not quite teal and orange, not quite aqua and brown, but it's something a bit off. I mean, it's in that vein, but it's leaning more towards the green range, which typically people do that for like dream sequences or something that's a little bit more sci-fi. And it's like that meets this noir sort of feel from the period based on the dress. They don't quite shoot it like a horror movie like they did with like the X-Files or say something like Supernatural. They shoot it more like a futuristic sci-fi show, even though it's set in the past. The contrast between the time period and the futuristic sort of sci-fi color palette works surprisingly well. Even down to the color choices for, for example, Captain Quinn's Air Force uniform is blue, and so is Aidan Guillen's eyes. But Hynek, Aidan Guillen's character, typically wears like a brown fedora and trench coat. So it really plays to those color contrasts. And you can see even in scenes where they have like a brown dominant interior in the foreground, for example, at the Hynek home, and he's coming in, taking off his coat and jacket and stuff, you'll see right in the center of the screen in a room that is unoccupied and all the lights are off, there's like a blue hue or a greenish hue to it. I mean, there's no digital clocks in 1952, so there's really no reason for that room to be lit up with those colors. It has no real logical place, but the visual aesthetic, the contrast, makes it pleasing to watch and keeps the scene from being boring by having too many similar colors all pouring onto the screen at the same time. Anyway, so enough gushing. I'm going to stop here. I hope you get a sense of what I'm going to do with this cast, or what I plan to do, or at least attempt to try to do with the show. And it won't just be like watching shows and recapping them and talking about them. I plan to listen to like the History Channel's sponsored official podcast and the interviews they do there, watch their mini documentaries, and then kind of bring it all together with more information and observations than what they have in there. More detailed stories on what the real events were versus what was in the show, and then kind of going over the plot summaries and stuff like that. That's the dream anyway. I know most people come up with these pithy and clever closers or puns for their podcast that kind of play off their topic, and I suppose I could do that, but I think I'm just going to end with a single bit of wisdom I learned a long time ago. Bitches get the stitches.